Hey guys, Brian here with Better Chess Training, and in this video we're going to follow up on the video I did on the 4 C's of the chess thought process, and I'm going to show you an example from one of my training exercises on how I apply those steps of the thought process to solving a problem. Okay, this position comes from one of the exercises from Grandmaster Aagaard's book, Grandmaster Preparation Calculation. It's actually a very good book so far, or at least for me, and it has very highly regarded. His whole series on Grandmaster Preparation series is very good for advanced players. In any case, uh, what I'm going to show you here is how I went about using the 4 steps of the thought process that I explained in a previous video. And I actually wrote down my thoughts here in this notebook. So I'm going to share how I went through it. So feel free to pause it and try to solve it yourself. But this video is not about showing you all the possible lines, but just how I followed that process in order to find the answer. Okay, so well, let's get to it. Okay, the first phase that I go through is what I call the consideration phase or the consider phase. And here I'm looking at all the relevant aspects of the position that I'm going to need to consider to come up with my candidate move, is the second step. And as I mentioned in my video on the 4 C's, you don't always have to follow the steps linear, like in a linear fashion. Sometimes you're going to jump back and forth, but it is structured to kind of build upon each other, as you'll see as we go through this. Okay, well, in this particular position, and I'm just going to go look right from my notebook here. It is a very sharp position because we can see that Black has is threatening to take this piece with check, and there's a lot of mating threats here. You see this bishop is covering the h3 square. So I wrote down here that this needs to be a forcing sequence. So that makes things a little bit easier. Of course, I do have the knowledge here that it is basically a tactical problem, but of course you can apply the same principles to your own games in a positional position as well. So um, I noted here that the rook on c1 is hanging, that my queen is being attacked, the pawn on e5 is protected, so I can't take it with the queen. And so some of these in your games, these are very quick observations, but then we'll also notice here that the c file is cut off. Okay, so from here, I came up with some goals of what are some candidates that are going to attack the king. And often it's very helpful to look at the forcing ones first. So because blacks can always attack with a check here, with rook takes c1 check, then we need to look at our checks first. Also, I quickly, and I didn't really write this in my notebook, but I would have seen that moving the king to safety or moving the rook to safety maybe isn't that great either, just because of this possibility of knight to g3 check. Okay, so these are all the things before I even come up with moves that I want to look at. So the main candidates, I had 3 candidates that I wrote down: rook to h7 check, queen to g7 check, and queen to h7 check. So these are all the possible checks. Obviously, there's checks like queen to d8 check, queen to e8 check, and queen to f8 check, which maybe I could look at, but seeing that they can be taken by the rook, I quickly eliminated those as candidates. So I'm mainly looking at those first 3: rook to h7 check, queen to g7 check, and queen to h7 check. So from this point, when I was solving the problem, and by the way, this whole process took about 20 minutes. I didn't. Sometimes I write down the time, but I set a 20-minute timer usually for these exercises. Took 20 minutes to do this, write it all down, and then check the problem. Well, I checked the problem afterwards. So, okay. So moving on to the calculation phase. Now, in the calculation phase, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to show you what variations I looked at when solving the problems. If you went and solved this problem on your own, or you might come up with a different order or different variations. And the idea is not that mine are necessarily the best, but this is what I saw. And it's hard to do this phase without coming up with those candidates. And like I said in my previous video, sometimes we move to calculation too fast without looking at all the options. So So let me go ahead and take a look at this. The first variation I looked at was queen to g7 check. Okay, and here I first examined queen to d6, and later you'll see I looked at some other options. And then the first thing I looked at here was queen to g6 check, and here king to e7 is what I looked at next. And then I saw that rook to h7 check, king to d8, rook to h8 check. Let's see here. I looked at bishop to e8, and then from here I saw that queen to d6 was mate. So I went back a couple moves, and instead, let's see, I also saw the line kind of, luckily I write it in a way that I could kind of follow it. Rook to h7 check, king to d8. I also saw that I did look at queen to f6 check and saw that king to e8, queen to e7 was also mate. And so I went back to the beginning of the variation after queen to g7 check, and I said, what were some other options? Well, king to e6 is another option. And here I saw that queen takes g6 check leads back into that line with king to e7 and rook to h7 check. So did not go any further with that. And then after that, let's see, I went back to king to d6, queen to g6 check, and then I saw that black had bishop to e6. So I thought to myself, well, what can I do from here? And again, what I saw here was that sacrificing the queen doesn't get me anywhere. So queen takes e6 check, king takes e6. There's no checkmate here. And so black is going to be able to take over, and I've just sacrificed my queen. So I saw here that bishop to e6, there's no immediate checks that are safe. So from here, I actually went back and I went to my second candidate move. So this is something where you have to learn when to cut off your analysis. And I saw bishop to e6 as a problem point. I'm not saying that I can't continue that line, but let's now look at another candidate and see if that's better. By the way, so what I did next was let's go back to the beginning position. As I said, my initial candidates were rook to h7 check, queen to g7 check, and queen to h7 check. So here, I did not consider queen to h7 check because I figured it would lead to some of the same lines with that idea of bishop to e6. And here, interestingly, I went into rook to h7 check. And here, again, I responded first with king to d6. And then I saw queen to f6 check, bishop to e6. And then I had queen to e7 was mate. By the way, even though I'm moving the pieces here, this exercise was done all in my mind and writing down the variations. So just so you're clear, when you're doing this exercise and you're trying to train a training tip, you want to make sure you're not moving the pieces on the board. So you're training your visualization. Okay, so the next thing, hopefully I didn't lose my place here. I saw that queen to e7 was mate, so I actually went back, and after rook to h7 check, I looked at instead of king to d6, I looked at king to e6, and I wanted to see what my follow-up would be there, because what that does is that I can't play queen to f6 check anymore. And here's where I came up with an interesting move. I did notice that I have this particular move, bishop to f5 check. Okay, and the idea behind that was that here he's cut off here, and we see that if he moves his king over here, I've got my queen to f6 check here. So I explored, well, what happens with bishop to f5 check? Because we notice that these pawns are covering these squares here, and this can be very dangerous. By the way, this is where pattern recognition and doing those tactical problems, those basic tactics, come into play, because I don't really need to, I can see these kind of quickly. Okay, well, from here I looked at a natural move, g takes f 5, and now here we have rook to h6 check, and then I looked at king to e7, and then we have, let's see, in my notebook I actually wrote rook to f6, which is not a check, so I think I probably meant this, queen to f6 check, so I probably had an error in my notebook, and then I've got this thematic mating pattern right here. Okay, now going back, the king after this check, I also, let's see here, looked at, instead of taking with the pawn, I then looked at king takes f5, and then I saw that rook to f7 check, king to g5 falls to queen to h4 mate. And there's probably a couple other calculations that I might have looked at very quickly, but I didn't write them down. So the idea here is to try to capture your thoughts, because then I can actually examine them. So going back to the original position, I pretty much saw that after rook to h7 check, we saw that the king cannot go to d6 because we saw that mate. Let's go back here. And if he goes to, of course can't go, and the only other square he can go to is e6. And with e6, we looked at bishop to f5 check, and then all we have to do is just examine and make sure that all of those moves are correct. So some of the variations I didn't write down, just to be clear. Bishop to f5 check, we looked at g takes f5, we looked at king takes f5. The only other legal move here is this one, which is king to d6, but then we go back to this queen to f6 idea, and after blocking, we have queen takes e6 mate. So at this point in doing the exercise, then I'm doing this on actually on Chessable. I decided rook to h7 mate, check leads to a checkmate in all variations. So at that point, I can stop. I don't have to look at any other candidates because I see that it's a forced mate. So when it comes to the choose phase, now this is a particularly straightforward problem, because the evaluation, once you have a forced variation that is mate, then I don't really, as long as my calculations were accurate in between, I don't need to look any further. Okay, and finally, so looking at the original position, having found found all the factors that were relevant after coming up with some candidate moves, and then doing the calculations as I showed you, I was able to choose and found my principal variation following that rook to h7 check. And here I'm just going to show you what happened when I played through this on Chessable. I did play rook to h7 check, which was the correct move. And here the line that was in the book is king to e6. And then from there, we see the key move here, which is bishop to f5 check. And the author of the book actually said this was the key move that you needed to see. So I was glad to be able to see it. And then after g takes f5, and again, we talked about this already. I saw this ahead of time. Rook to h6 check, king to e7, queen to f6 check, king to e8, and then rook to h8, as I had calculated before I tried solving the problem. So it's very satisfying to solve this problem, and also just wanted to show you how those 4 steps can be applied. And again, it's not just for solving problems, but actually when you're making moves in your long time control games or correspondence games. I hope you found that video helpful. What I would encourage you to do, if you haven't done so already, is check out the video on the 4 steps of the thought process and see how you can apply it in your games or in your training. And let me know in the comments if is there anything further you want to explore in this, or anything you want me to explain a little further, and maybe we could do that in a future video. If you are a patron, you can download, and the link will be in the description below, you can download a PGN of this position and all the variations, as well as my annotations, so you can study it further. Okay, I'll see you in the next video, and good luck with your chess.